The events of this story took place in a lonely, cold lighthouse on a deserted island. There, 31-year-old Lee Ojin, a lowly employee, worked alone as he hadn't seen his shift partner in a long time. He had secured the job through a tough competition, with 50 applicants for each position, yet the salary remained laughable. And he had no one except for his brother, with whom Lee Ojin had also ruined family relations. Lee Ojin was a typical loser, destined to work in a place devoid of people. But one day, everything changed. A strange marine virus swept across the world. Humanity was on the brink of survival, and now the former failure had to prove himself to survive and save his loved ones. This story carries many mysteries, and they all must be unraveled. Supplies were running low at the lighthouse. The nearest civilization was 2 hours away by boat. The internet had been down for several days, possibly due to the heavy rain. Suddenly, someone knocked on the iron door during the rain at the lonely lighthouse. When the door opened, the face of a man appeared. It turned out to be Mr. Park, a fisherman. They hadn't seen each other in a month. He hadn't come over due to the downpour. Often, such avid fishermen would arrive during the season and fish for several days. The fisherman brought Lee Ojin a large fish, although the young man had neither soy sauce nor seasoning. Mr. Park, dissatisfied with the guard's outbursts, came to ask for water. At that moment, his cunning gaze fell upon the first aid kit. Mr. Park requested a bandage, a couple of adhesive plasters, and some ointment. He claimed he had scratched himself a bit, and his friend had too. Although it looked entirely different, the man eventually left. Lee Ojin took the fish. It was surprisingly heavy, but when he turned it over, he noticed the same thing that had been on Mr. Park's cheek. Lee Ojin thought it was just a marine parasite. However, when he cut into the fish, he saw those strange things again. They seemed to be trying to crawl out from inside, and a stench of rotten fish emanated from them. Suddenly, Lee Ojin noticed a large ship. It was approaching directly toward the lighthouse. But when he climbed up, there was no ship to be found. It seemed he had merely imagined it. The radar showed nothing either. It was definitely some sort of mistake. After some time recalling that moment, Lee Ojin always thought about two things: what he had done right and what he had done wrong. It was wrong not to learn more about that strange ghost ship, but it was right that Lee Ojin had not eaten the fish that Mr. Park had given him. Meanwhile, a new day had arrived. Lee Ojin was asleep, but he woke up from hunger and anger that the replacement had not come. The partner could have at least shown up to bring supplies. Finally, Lee Ojin got up to prepare some noodles. Suddenly, he caught a strong stench coming from the sink. It was the remnants left by the young man from the fish, but it turned out to be something else entirely. A large number of sea parasites had infested the sink and pipes. Lee Ojin felt the urge to scrape them off with a knife. Just then, there was another knock at the door. The guard knew it was Mr. Park again, and asked why he was knocking so loudly and forcefully, but the fisherman remained silent. He seemed very strange, though he did not say a word. Suddenly, the face of the fisherman appeared. It, like the body, was covered in those sea parasites. It looked very disgusting, and it also smelled foul. Mr. Park was approaching Lee Ojin, after which he suddenly lunged at the guard with shouts. Mr. Park chased him up the stairs and looked strangely deranged. Lee Ojin initially decided to hide in a safe place. When he closed the door behind him, he heard strange thumping sounds, so the guard decided to take a look at what was happening through a crack. Lee Ojin saw a horrifying scene as Mr. Park devoured raw fish with his bare hands. The fisherman was also eating the entrails that the guard had thrown away. The young man concluded that Mr. Park had reacted to the smell. Then his gaze fell on the body lotion. It seemed suitable to mask the scent and allow the young man to escape outside. Coated and fragrant, Lee Ojin cautiously made his way to the kitchen, after which he quietly walked to the iron door, and finally he quickly ran outside, after which he locked the door behind him. Lee Ojin began to call for Mr. Kim, but due to the heavy rain, it was futile. Suddenly, the guard noticed the fisherman's tent, although it looked eerie, with traces of blood and battle. But there was no choice, so Lee Ojin entered inside amidst Mr. Park's cries. He took a knife from there, flashlights, a fishing rod, to defend himself in case of danger. For some reason, Lee Ojin could not shake the thought of where Mr. Kim had gone. He thought that he might have already been killed, and that made it all the more terrifying. But his attention quickly shifted to the phone and the keys to the boat. Lee Ojin thought it would be best to paddle to Baekjeongdo right now and ask for help. At first, the guard did not want to leave Mr. Park at the lighthouse, but the cries were getting closer, which meant that Mr. Pak had escaped from the lighthouse. So Lee Ojin ran to the boat without a second thought. The engine was running, so the young man immediately set off. The waves were very harsh, nearly capsizing the boat, but Lee Ojin managed to steer it. The weather was not suitable for sailing. He decided to quickly call for help before the phone died. Lee Ojin dialed 119 with 1% battery left, and the ringtone began to play. But unfortunately, the phone immediately died. Suddenly, the young man noticed that the ringtone had not stopped playing. He thought that Mr. Kim's phone might be somewhere on the boat. Lee Ojin began searching for it on board. The ringtone spoke of a child left home alone, peacefully sleeping. The young man was troubled that the sound was audible, yet the phone was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, Lee Ojin felt the boat sway. A strong wave appeared before him once again, and because of this, Mr. Kim managed to climb aboard. He looked just like Mr. Park. Sea parasites protruded from his body. They were even in his mouth. A ringing and ringtone echoed from his pocket. The man emerged on deck, his body resembling that of a corpse. Lee Ojin stared at him for far too long, because in that very moment he vomited. For some reason, this caught Mr. Kim's attention intensely, and he began to approach Lee Ojin once more. But the boy did not lose his composure. He grabbed a fishing rod. With all his might, he struck Mr. Kim on the head with it. But this yielded no significant result. Lee Ojin's heart began to race. He had to think quickly about how to save himself. He started to feel around behind him for something useful. And finally, Lee Ojin found something. He threw a solid concrete block tied to a rope with great force. He even managed to wrap the weapon around Mr. Kim's neck. The man continued to draw closer regardless. He was almost at Lee Ojin's face. But the young man quickly reacted and jumped back. The rope saved him as well. He tried to calm himself, for if the boat capsized, it would be the end for him. Suddenly, Lee Ojin noticed that the rope was about to snap. Mr. Kim had an immense amount of strength. The guard began to flee to the other side of the boat before the rope broke. It was hanging by a thread. Lee Ojin grabbed the helm and began to steer. But no one could withstand the fury of nature. The waves rocked the boat. Lee Ojin realized that his end was approaching swiftly. He could not understand how Mr. Kim endured everything and could snap the rope. But the young man had to come up with something very quickly. Suddenly, a port appeared. It was very close, just a little longer to hold on. But at that moment, a sound erupted, and Lee Ojin's expression changed sharply. For Mr. Kim's rope had snapped. Lee Ojin thought he could jump, though he hesitated. But Mr. Kim's screams made the choice for him. The young man dove into the water. He resurfaced. Lee Ojin began to swim further, aiming to reach Baekyeongdo. Suddenly, a massive wave appeared before him. It completely engulfed the young man, towering about 10 feet high. And Lee Ojin found himself underwater. Suddenly, his life began to flash before his eyes. His only family was just one brother. Lee Ojin had failed exams 5 times, yet his brother still supported him. Then, the young man heard his brother's voice commanding him to gather himself. Lee Ojin opened his eyes and decided to act, although he struggled to manage his body against the waves. But Lee Ojin could not die like this. He did not want that. His body sank lower and was about to hit the underwater rocks. Some time passed, and there was no one at the port. Suddenly he appeared there, Lee Ojin. The young man pulled himself together and crawled onto the dock, collapsing weakly onto the concrete. Tears of joy streamed from his eyes, grateful to have survived and not let his brother down. He pondered whether what happened with Mr. Kim and Park would be considered self-defense. One of them remained at the lighthouse. This would be proof. The heavy rain continued, and Lee Ojin shivered, deciding he needed to get up. He thought he would go to the police first thing in the morning, but for now he had to find somewhere to hide. Since it was night, his namesake Lee Ojin was closed. So the young man decided to go to the precinct chief. He tugged at the door, but it was locked from the inside. Everything felt very strange. Lee Ojin stood outside, not understanding what had happened at all. After a moment, he stepped back a bit, frustrated that something odd was occurring. Suddenly, the young man felt unwell. He began to sway, nearly falling to his knees. It seemed that Lee Ojin had fallen ill. He needed rest. He remembered there should be a spare key near the main entrance. His hand slipped through the crack, trying to feel for the key, and finally, Lee Ojin found it. He opened the door and felt relieved that he had been drinking with the chief. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known where to go. Lee Ojin stepped inside and froze, but no one could be heard. Everything was clean, so he ventured further in. A strange stench lingered in the corridor. Lee Ojin sensed it, but could not discern where it was coming from. Suddenly, he heard the sound of water as he took a step. The entire floor was wet. He looked down and saw many bugs scattered across the floor. After that, Lee Ojin took a step back and stepped on another bug. It turned out to be a sea roach. He was surprised, as such roaches lived on the seaside but certainly not indoors. However, Lee Ojin felt so unwell that he immediately dismissed the thought and moved on. After that, he opened the door. But the roach he had crushed suddenly crawled away like a walking corpse. Meanwhile, Lee Ojin was already in the room, found water, and drank it greedily. After that, he simply collapsed onto the bed, utterly exhausted and completely drained of energy. Yet even in his fatigue, thoughts about what was happening and what the roach was doing there lingered in his mind. Still, fatigue won out, and Lee Ojin fell asleep within a second. Loud shouts were heard. Someone was arguing about who would raise him. Lee Ojin listened through the crack in the door. His brother said he would raise San-ha, so he asked not to speak such words in his presence, especially since the younger brother was also listening. The woman shouted that he would be in poverty and loneliness until the very end. After that, she told him to do as he wished and live his whole life with his good-for-nothing brother, and she stamped the documents. Then the woman stood up and left, saying that Lee Ojin's brother knew how to ruin other people's families. The younger brother heard everything and felt deeply hurt by all those words. The older brother sat silently, eyes closed. Inside him, a storm of emotions raged with feelings of hurt and injustice. But when he realized that Lee Ojin was nearby, he immediately smiled and offered to eat. Suddenly, Lee Ojin woke up screaming. He was gasping loudly, his heart racing wildly after such a dream. Sadness enveloped Lee Ojin. He froze for a moment and simply thought. This was not a dream, but memories. As if suddenly the young man noticed that his blanket was completely wet. He thought he must have sweated so much or something else. At that moment, Lee Ojin heard some shouts outside the door. He pressed closer to the door and realized that people were arguing. So he was not alone. Lee Ojin felt a surge of joy and wanted to open the door to ask for help. But suddenly, something stopped him. He thought he hadn't locked the door with the chain earlier. After all, the floor was flooded. And a strange stench continued to seep into the room. Lee Ojin decided that he had lost his mind to sleep with the door open in such an environment. So the young man simply locked the door. After that, he stepped into the hallway and saw the couple that had been arguing before. He was surprised that now they were sweetly holding hands, even though just a second ago there had been a lot of shouting. Lee Ojin wanted to ask them something, but he immediately stopped as he felt an overwhelming stench. When the young man looked closer, he realized that the stench was coming from them. They were also infected, just like the fisherman at the lighthouse. Lee Ojin immediately began to run with all his might, but those monsters chased after him. He quickly dashed into a room and locked the door behind him. The monsters were talking about divorce. Lee Ojin did not understand what kind of nonsense that was. Suddenly, a hand burst through the door. Right next to Lee Ojin, he was so frightened that he couldn't even react. The monster tried to grab him, but the young man quickly fled. He moved on instinct, as he himself did not understand what was happening or what to do. Suddenly, his leg began to itch and tremble. He thought that the same sea parasites were on it. Lee Ojin rolled up his pant leg and shook his foot, causing many sea slugs to fall out. The young man realized that these bugs were all over his body and began to scream as he tried to shake them off. Meanwhile, the monster was trying to break into Lee Ojin's room. Their grotesque faces instilled fear. The young man was in a stupor. He thought that this was the end for him. The monster's hand was about to reach Lee Ojin. The young man stood frozen, fear gripping his body. Suddenly, something began to bang loudly from above. All the monster's attention was now focused on that. This was what saved Lee Ojin this time. The monster left, muttering about a divorce, saying it could wait no longer. Lee Ojin collapsed to the floor, drained of strength. He had just experienced intense stress, and his body had let him down. Next time, he might not be so lucky. The young man got up when he finally calmed down. His stomach began to growl from hunger. He looked around to see if there was anything edible in the room. His gaze fell upon a packet of 3-in-1 coffee. Lee Ojin decided to at least quell his hunger a bit with that. But he forgot that he had recently drunk all the water and the powder got stuck in his throat. Lee Ojin decided to drink from the tap. But unfortunately, there was no water. Then a strange idea came to the young man's mind. But there was no other choice. Lee Ojin bent down sharply and took one sip just to moisten his throat. Immediately, he felt nauseous. It turned out that when extremely hungry, one could feel stomach pain. Then his attention was drawn to the sink. There was standing water with some hair in it. Lee Ojin hesitated, wondering if he should drink from there, as the hair was a sort of protein, and he could close his eyes and drink it as if it were noodle soup. But common sense prevailed, and the young man rejected this idea. Then he decided to go to the first floor. Perhaps there was some food left near the counter. First, Lee Ojin needed to find out if any people or monsters had been walking in the corridor. He peeked through a crack. There was a pair in the corridor, but they were quite far away. So Lee Ojin decided to sneak out quietly. He silently prayed that the monsters would not return. Suddenly, a seagull flew in through the window behind Lee Ojin. The young man felt a chill inside. He froze in fear. The monsters immediately reacted to the bird. A man grabbed it sharply with his bare hand. Everything happened very quickly. After that, the monsters began to devour it. Raw, straight from the feathers. They behaved like wild beasts. Lee Ojin stood in shock, watching this unfold. He couldn't move from the fear and shock of witnessing something he never could have imagined. But eventually, the young man found the strength within himself and moved forward, not looking back and trying not to vomit. He took a step and immediately stepped into something disgusting. The corridor was in a horrific state, as if after some apocalypse. Everything was covered in blood and a strange liquid. Then Lee Ojin noticed the administration door and decided to go inside. Surprisingly, everything inside was clean. It seemed the monsters had not reached this place. And there was food as well. Lee Ojin was immensely grateful for that. He immediately began to feast, eating and drinking to the point where he could hardly stand. His happiness knew no bounds. Afterward, he rewarded himself with something sweet, and now felt a bit more confident that he could survive and stand up for himself. At that moment, Lee Ojin found something else. It was a set of car keys. The young man knew they belonged to the chief's truck, so he took the keys just in case. After that, his gaze fell upon a canister. He assumed it contained water, but it turned out to be kerosene. Lee Ojin decided that this could also come in handy to mask the smell or start a fire. He hid it along with a lighter under the bed. After that, Lee Ojin began to ponder what to do next, as until then all his thoughts had been about food. He could go to the police, or to the hospital. The most important thing was to escape the monster's lair. He had locked the entrance on the first floor. It seemed the young man could no longer go to the second floor. Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck him. He could exit through the window in the restroom. Lee Ojin was about to leave, but then realized it was dangerous to go without a weapon. So he took duct tape, a knife, and a stick, and fashioned a makeshift weapon. Now he could escape this nightmare. Lee Ojin was filled with enthusiasm and confidence. Suddenly his expression changed drastically, and all confidence vanished, replaced by apathy and fear. For before him was a shattered window, completely overgrown with sea parasites. Lee Ojin now had no idea what to do. Passing through all that seemed utterly impossible. Suddenly he felt a presence behind him. It was a monster, constantly repeating something about filming and fittings. But then something even more horrifying happened, for behind this monster was a whole bunch of others hiding in the stalls. Now Lee Ojin had no chance of escaping the restroom at all. Lee Ojin stood in a stupor, trembling in fear, not knowing what to do. Suddenly he found strength from somewhere and struck the monster with his weapon, breaking the wood into pieces. The monster flew back, but it didn't yield any significant results. Only a broken weapon and greater panic for Lee Ojin. Then he decided to simply run and not look back, so as not to fall into a stupor again. Lee Ojin burst out of the bathroom, but a monster chased after him. The young man ran to the exit and completely forgot that the door was locked. Then he decided to run upstairs and leap out of the window on the second floor. But right on the stairs, he was confronted by 2 more monsters and a terrible stench. And now Lee Ojin was trapped in a snare of his own making. Surrounded by monsters in front and behind, there was nowhere to run. Suddenly something began to thump from above. The monsters stopped, their attention fully drawn to the sound. Lee Ojin had a chance. It was now or never. He quickly opened the door, after which Lee Ojin shot out like a bullet, his heart pounding so hard he was composed of 80% adrenaline. Just as swiftly, he slammed the door shut behind him. Now the young man could exhale and feel safe. But when he lifted his eyes, his expression changed abruptly. He saw a woman before him, or rather a body hanging above the ground. Lee Ojin immediately covered his face with his hand to avoid feeling nauseous. On the floor, he spotted the woman's belongings and a note. He picked it up to read. It was an apology to her mother for failing the entrance exams and for what she had done. Lee Ojin remarked that he had also passed his exams only on the 5th try, but it was worth living just a little longer. After that, the young man looked around to survey the room. He decided that his main task now was to survive and not think about other things. So Lee Ojin retrieved her backpack and began searching for useful items. He found a phone, which was good news, but there was hardly any charge left, as always. Lee Ojin's curiosity piqued, and he decided to reread the messages with her mother. There, she scolded her daughter for such results, but then apologized and asked her to call. After this, the young man fell into deep sadness and turned off the phone. Suddenly, a strange thought crossed his mind. He reread the note. It mentioned that now she would be forever with Yongju. Lee Ojin's hands began to tremble, his fingers became damp, and his heart raced wildly. This meant she was not alone here. There were two of them. At that very moment, the same sounds were heard. Lee Ojin realized that the sound was not coming from outside. At that moment, the bathroom door swung open, and a gray head appeared. It was the girl's boyfriend. He no longer resembled a human. Lee Ojin grabbed a piece of charcoal and lit it. It was meant to at least mask the smell. The boy's neck was wrapped in a hose from the faucet in the bathroom. He screamed that he wanted to live and begged for forgiveness from Haiju. Suddenly, Lee Ojin stepped on a remote control while backing away, and he activated the emergency broadcast. It reported on the aftermath of the typhoon in certain areas. At that moment, a knock was heard at the door, after which a monster suddenly burst into the room. Lee Ojin was in a stupor from fear and shock at what was happening. He could think of nothing better than to simply cover himself with a blanket. The smell of coal meant the monsters wouldn't hear him, so they pounced on the girl's boyfriend. Lee Ojin sat under the blanket, trembling with fear. But then he managed to pull himself together. He began to run, covering his mouth to keep from gagging. But right at the exit, next to him, many more monsters appeared as if from nowhere. Lee Ojin immediately started screaming and running upstairs. But monsters were everywhere. The entire place was crawling with them. Every floor was filled with monsters. Lee Ojin was trapped. His heart raced wildly and his body wouldn't obey. He had only one way out, to run to the roof. A monster was approaching. Lee Ojin thought it was the end for him. He immediately remembered his brother, the only family he had, and the young man had let him down. Lee Ojin longed to see his niece one more time. No, it couldn't end like this. The young man gritted his teeth and steadied himself. He had to live, for his brother's sake. The monsters were getting closer, and there were now more of them. Lee Ojin stood firm, preparing himself. He counted to 3. Suddenly, someone called to him from a pipe and ordered him to run. Lee Ojin turned back. The young man obeyed as he had no other choice. It was strange to trust some pipe, but in his panic, he didn't stop to think and just saved his own life. Inside, there was something slippery. Suddenly, Lee Ojin felt a sharp pain. A monster had grabbed him by the shoe and bit down hard. Lee Ojin began to scream for it to let him go. Just then, a katana whizzed past him. It hit its mark, and the monster fell back from Lee Ojin. So now he could crawl further, overcoming his fear. But that was not the end. Someone began to pull the blanket back from him. Then, a liquid with a sharp but pleasant aroma was poured over him, after which the blanket was shoved back, sealing the hole. Now Lee Ojin could exhale with relief. He saw several such cans and realized it was fabric conditioner. He was told that if mixed with rainwater and sprayed, it became very slippery and the local scent could be removed. In front of him stood a brave, beautiful girl. She had just saved Lee Ojin's life. The young man asked how she knew this, to which she replied that she had done it before. After that, she began to strike with her weapon from above. Lee Ojin now understood who had been making those sounds that had been saving him all along. The girl was delighted that it helped. At that moment, someone called her name Sylvie. A few people in similar clothing stood behind her, looking rather displeased. One guy told Sylvie that he had already warned her not to help anyone, as he might be infected. Lee Ojin asked if they were all students, having deduced this from their uniforms. It turned out they were all from Hanguk University, staying at a motel because they had connections. But then the monsters appeared. At first they managed to barricade themselves somewhat, but eventually the monsters broke in. Any contact with them could be dangerous. Sylvie then asked Lee Ojin if anyone had bitten or scratched him, but they were interrupted by the guy who reminded everyone that he was in charge here. He then pointed upward and said that the noise came from their classmates. He didn't know how it all happened, as they were drunk, but he was sure it all started after the rain. Lee Ojin listened to everything and asked how they prepared food, adding that he had already eaten and brought some candies with him. But he was ignored and rudely interrupted. The guy was furious and gritted his teeth, telling Lee Ojin to leave. Silbi, like the young man, was shocked and confused. She immediately began to defend the newcomer, saying it was dangerous outside. The guy bluntly stated that he was the leader here and they couldn't afford to feed another person. Silbi tried to argue that perhaps Lee Ojin could help them get out of there, but the guy said the stranger looked like an ordinary slacker. She stood her ground, insisting they should first listen to Lee Ojin, and it worked. The classmates said in a condescending tone that Lee Ojin had heard everything already, so he should introduce himself. Lee Ojin explained what he did for a living, and then the guy ordered him to tell them everything, even about the organization he worked for, his duties, and all the names. But Silbi interrupted this tactless conversation, asking how Lee Ojin's leg was, since he had been bitten by a monster then. Lee Ojin was fine. She then introduced herself, stating she was 21 years old. The guy said his name wasn't necessary to know, just to call him the leader. Lee Ojin asked about his age, and noticed that the leader's manner of speaking was military style. The young man was right. He was a 22-year-old cadet from the officer training corps. At that moment, someone apologized for interrupting them, but he really wanted to leave. The look on this guy's face was quite grim. He also said he felt very unwell, so his girlfriend would introduce them both, after which, the girl abruptly approached Lee Ojin. It seemed everyone there was in a negative mood. Then she introduced herself. Her name was Hwang Ga-e, and the guy was No One Bin. She assured them that no one had bitten the guy and he wasn't infected. Then Kwan Song-tae introduced himself. He was studying law and was friendlier than the others. Next, Cha E-yong introduced herself. She was studying in the aviation department and was also not very welcoming. Silbi said she didn't understand how it all happened, as they had been drunk, and when they woke up, monsters were everywhere. So they decided to barricade themselves here together, but there were probably still surviving students outside. Then Silbi asked how Lee Ojin ended up here since the doors were chained shut. He began to explain, but the leader interrupted him, saying he hadn't heard anything useful, so he asked him to leave. Lee Ojin felt downcast, as it wasn't pleasant to hear, but he still didn't want to linger and wanted to find his brother as soon as possible. He then told everyone he would leave right now. After that, he walked toward the pipe, but Silbi stopped him to give him some food. She then asked what Lee Ojin planned to do next, to which he replied that he would first find a boat. He looked through the crack. The corridor was clear. If Lee Ojin moved quietly, the monsters wouldn't hear him. Silbi was worried that there might be even more monsters around the motel, but the young man reassured her that there was a car. At that moment, the leader ordered Lee Ojin to stop. He added that if he had a car, that would be a completely different conversation. Silbi whispered to Lee Ojin that the leader had changed his mind because he didn't know how to drive. Then the leader honestly confessed that their supplies were running low and there were no medicines, but none of them knew how to drive. Lee Ojin inquired why they all needed medicine, and then the leader reminded him of No One Bin, who could barely stand. His girlfriend was crying at that moment and said that he desperately needed medicine. They entered the room of the boy who was lying on the bed. No One Bin said that his insides were twisted, and it felt like he was being cut open from the inside. The boy looked truly terrible. He also had a cold. Lee Ojin asked if they were all sure that this was safe, and an irritated Hwang Ga-e tried to prove otherwise with her shouts. The leader said that their classmates acted the same way when they got infected, but Hwang Ga-e stood her ground, insisting that she had thoroughly checked his skin. Sun Tae said that it sounded unconvincing, and the leader agreed, adding that the couple was covering for each other. Hwang Ga-e was furious and ordered them to check everything themselves if they didn't believe her. No One Bin interjected, assuring them that no one had bitten him. It was so hard for him to speak, and he had to prove his innocence as well. Then Hwang Ga-e ordered everyone to leave the room in a stern voice because only she had the right to see her boyfriend naked. E-yong, leaving, told Hwang Ga-e to close the door, as even for $1 million she wouldn't agree to see such a horror. Lee Ojin thought that perhaps he should quickly escape as well, since the prospect of looking at a naked boy did not please him. But there was no choice, and everyone began to examine the naked No One Bin. It turned out that he indeed had not a single scratch on him. Then Hwang Ga-e asked Lee Ojin to go with them to the store and the pharmacy. Although she was rude, her weakness was evident in moments like this. Lee Ojin hesitated about what to do. It would be easier to continue on his own, but he could trust these students. Still, he agreed to stay with them until they got some food. Sylvie began to voice her thoughts that there were guests on the second and third floors, while the fourth was empty. Lee Ojin asked how she knew that. It turned out that Sylvie was the deputy and secretary of the leader and had made the reservations. The administration had intentionally placed everyone on only 2 floors to avoid disturbance. From Sylvie's account, Lee Ojin realized that only he was aware of the real situation in the motel. There were monsters on all floors except the 5th, but everything could have changed during his absence. Suddenly, Sylvie ordered everyone to stop as she had a plan, but she would tell them about it in the lobby and ask them to take their mobile phones with them. The boys were outraged by such an order, but they agreed. Lee Ojin stepped out of the room and suddenly noticed something horrifying. There was a soup of shellfish on the floor. It contained the same sea parasites. Lee Ojin asked Sylvie who had eaten it, but she didn't know the exact answer, as each room had different dishes. Then he asked if she had eaten it, but it turned out that Sylvie didn't like seafood. Lee Ojin hoped his suspicions were unfounded, but he had to be very cautious now. Meanwhile, the company had already collected the phones, and Sylvie ordered them to tie them together, after which they threw them out the window. Sylvie explained that the alarms would go off in 3 minutes, and the monsters would rush to the sound. The leader wanted to volunteer and hold the rope while the others went to the car. He began to boast that only he could take on this responsible role and would retrieve the phones in time because he had the best reflexes. Ye Yong refused to go with them, although Sylvie tried to persuade her, but it was in vain. So the team approached the pipe and waited for the signal. Everyone applied fabric softener to mask the smell, and Lee Ojin climbed in first, trying to gather himself and not show fear. Meanwhile, the alarms went off. Everything was going according to plan. The monsters reacted to the alarms, and the team was able to pass by. Lee Ojin led the way as the senior and reached for the door. But behind it was a monster that no one expected to see. Everyone was frightened and stood in shock. The monster didn't hear the alarms due to the balyanuses in its ears. Lee Ojin's hand began to tremble with fear. He himself was afraid of these monsters, but the students were counting on him. So he gathered all his courage and swung the knife sharply, striking the monster. Lee Ojin acted reflexively and hit the monster, pushing it out of the way. The monster fell down the stairs, and Lee Ojin ordered the rest to flee quickly. They ran out to the parking lot and discussed that they could be accused of murder later. Suddenly, a monster grabbed someone by the leg. It was Huang Ga-yi. She screamed in fear while the others stood in shock. Only Sylvie reacted quickly, pulling out a spray and a lighter and running to help. After which, she simply burned the monster, and it released Huang Ga-yi. Meanwhile, Lee Ojin finally found the car in the parking lot and was very happy about it. He immediately checked everything. In fact, he was much more resourceful than he thought. After Lee Ojin found nothing, he went inside and ordered everyone to get in quickly. And the young man started the car after everyone was seated. 2 were in the trailer outside, while the rest were inside. Meanwhile, the monsters had already exited the building. They were heading straight for the car, but the team managed to drive away first. The alarms had delayed the monsters very well. Sylvie sat next to Lee Ojin. He noticed a bottle and asked what it was for. It turned out she had read in a magazine that hunters left their scent to distract prey, and Sylvie wanted to try it. The monsters were trying to catch up with them, but the team was faster. Lee Ojin pressed the gas, and they all headed to the supermarket. Sylvie climbed out the window and spilled water with her hair onto the floor. The monsters seemed to react to this. Sylvie asked what kind of monsters they were. Lee Ojin explained that they reminded him of balyanuses. Then she asked if they could help them if they contacted the mainland, as the situation there should be better. Sylvie clenched her hands, but it still didn't hide her fear and trembling. Lee Ojin noticed this and tried to calm her down, saying they would get off the island and everything would be fine. The road was terrible, just dirt and everything was in water. Suddenly, Lee Ojin noticed a cat flying out of a dumpster, as if someone had thrown it away. It turned out there was a monster rummaging through the trash in search of water. Lee Ojin wondered if the lack of water would affect them all, as all the monsters had gathered around the toilets and sinks in the hotel. Meanwhile, they had all reached the nearest supermarket. The glass was not broken there, despite the large amount of blood and scratches. The employees had probably fled. Lee Ojin got out of the car, and his expression suddenly changed. Panic and shock were in his eyes, because the entire road was flooded. The sea level had risen sharply. Everything had changed drastically since Lee Ojin first arrived. The hotel was situated at a height, so it hadn't been so noticeable, but the rest were not as concerned. Huang Ga-yi went first to get the medicine. Song Tae was scared and said in a trembling voice that it was theft and they could be arrested, so they had to leave money at the register. But no one listened to him. Everyone just went into the store. The doors to the store were open, so they simply walked in. Lee Ojin immediately checked the tap, and there was no water. So the team began to gather food and water. He distributed commands to everyone about what to take with them, as he had thought about it the whole way. Lee Ojin took dog food, as the canned goods were more effective, although Silbi grimaced. Suddenly, she noticed something and headed somewhere. Silbi took whiskey. She thought it was a good idea. But from Lee Ojin's expression, she realized she was mistaken. Although then he changed his mind, saying they could take one bottle as it might still be needed. Silbi noticed that Lee Ojin was taking few things for himself. He explained that he was leaving the rest for others. She smiled and said they had a lot in common, as Silbi was just as kind. Meanwhile, Huang Ga-e was walking between the aisles, shouting that she couldn't find the medicine at all. She got angry at Song Tae for not looking for medicine for himself, as he was gathering water. The last hope was the checkout area, and Huang Ga-e found medicine there. She was picking up various ones, saying that her beloved didn't like pills, so he would drink more liquids, after which she yelled again at Song Tae, ordering him to take everything that was left. He was a strong coward, and complained that Huang Ga-e could have taken the medicine herself, but she kept asking him to do it. Song Tae reached for the medicine. Suddenly, something grabbed his arm. Below was a monster that lunged at Song Tae and slashed his arm with its claws. The boy fell to the floor, blood pouring from his arm. He was infected. After that, the monster attacked him again and fell on top of him. It began to sink its claws into Song Tae while he cried out for help. Then the monster bit him on the neck, just like a vampire. Huang Ga-e watched in shock, trembling all over, but she apologized to Song Tae, saying she should have helped her boyfriend. So she simply turned and ran, saying her boyfriend would live thanks to Song Tae. Lee Ojin observed all of this. He said they needed to help Song Tae, but Silbi stopped him, saying it was too late. If he had already been bitten or scratched, it was the end. Silbi knew this because it had happened to her classmates. But if Lee Ojin wanted to help so badly, he had to prepare for their safety. Then they took duct tape. Carefully, they treated Song Tae's wounds. After that, they tied his hands and feet, and left him in the storage room like that. Then they themselves left. It was time for them to return. Outside, it started to rain. The downpour began as abruptly as it ended. The faces of Lee Ojin and Silbi changed sharply. This was due to the sight of a horde of monsters outside, who had come out to drink the rain. Huang Ga-e was screaming as she ran from the monster that had attacked Song Tae. Lee Ojin noticed that the monsters had become faster, and it was probably because of the rain, so he quickly directed everyone to get to the car as soon as possible. Suddenly, his expression changed sharply. He was shocked and angry at the same time. His car had started and then drove away. Huang Ga-e had left on her own, abandoning them with the monsters. Lee Ojin was furious at such betrayal. If he hadn't agreed to stay with the students, he would have been safe by now. The monsters were heading toward Lee Ojin and Silbi. While Lee Ojin was in anger and shock, Silbi took the initiative and ordered them to run inside. As soon as they entered, they immediately shut the door behind them. After that, they wrapped it with rope as well. The monsters continued to bang on the door. Lee Ojin and Silbi were a step away from death. They looked through the crack at what was happening outside. Silbi said she noticed two types of zombies. Those that moved quickly and those that moved slowly. She noticed this because her dad loved zombie movies. Suddenly, they heard loud noises coming from the storage room. They had locked the infected Song Tae in there. This made Silbi very sad, but she held it together. Then she said she was sure Huang Ga-e would do something similar. After all, this situation was not the first. Once, her boyfriend failed to pass the selection for extra classes, so Huang Ga-e forced Silbi to give up her place in the faculty. It was evident from Silbi's expression how much she was hurting from this situation, so she changed the subject and suggested they eat something. They were glad that they hadn't managed to take everything to the car and had left something behind. Silbi said she constantly thought ahead and therefore didn't take all the food. It seemed she was always anxious and planned for every possible scenario. Then Lee Ojin asked why she had given him food for the last time. It turned out it was so that if they ever met again, Lee Ojin would be kinder to her. He was pleasantly shocked by such an answer, so he praised Silbi for her cleverness. It was getting cold in the store, so Lee Ojin suggested they take some hand warmers and sit on them, covered with blankets. So they did just that. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Lee Ojin was thinking about what they should do next. He hoped there would be boats by the dock and they could escape. His train of thought was interrupted by Silby asking how old Lee Ojin was. After he answered, she said she could be his sister and asked him to call her brother instead of Mister. But Lee Ojin preferred the old version more. He blushed a little and said he was still a stranger to her. At that moment, someone was banging loudly on the warehouse door. Lee Ojin, as the elder, stood up to check what was happening. His expression changed sharply when he looked through the glass. Song Tae was thrashing about, tearing the duct tape off his mouth and screaming. Lee Ojin was in shock but tried not to show his fear. He said they had tied him up well, but the monster had still broken free. Its terrifying, bloody face was visible through the glass and instilled fear. Then calm Silby approached and said her classmates had behaved the same way. It seemed she understood the stages of the infection. First, the monsters complained about being cold or hot. Then they grew claws and their vision worsened, and then symptoms of rabies appeared. But what happened next, she still didn't know. Then, Lee Ojin asked what Silby thought about Ro Won Bin. She explained that no one had hurt him, but the symptoms were the same as those of the infected, so she was hesitant. Silby suddenly became curious about how Lee Ojin managed to escape and survive. He told her the whole story, saying that the liquid from the sea cockroaches masked the scent more effectively. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a tapping on the store's glass. Silby revealed that she had given names to all the monsters. It was a braggart. There was also a pretender, a scammer, and Hannah. Only one monster had a human name, because it was Silby's classmate. Lee Ojin felt her sadness when she mentioned her friend. But then he turned and walked away. He grabbed a bag that was near the cash register. After that, he poured some liquid onto it, and he stuck this mixture onto the glass right in front of Silby's face. He told her not to blame herself for this, but rather for them to come up with a way to get out of this place. Lee Ojin was an empath, and he felt sad for Silby. He tried to think of a way to cheer her up, but his thoughts were interrupted by Silby. She asked if Lee Ojin had spilled his water on the floor. He immediately understood what was going on. After that, he looked through the glass outside to confirm his suspicion. It turned out he was right, and the water level had risen so much that a flood had begun. Lee Ojin told Silby that the door wouldn't withstand such pressure, but he had a plan. They put on life vests, for they would always find one on the island near the port. They also gathered all the food and made a candle, as the water was rising faster than they had anticipated. Lee Ojin discovered that Silby's heat pack was almost cold, so he suggested getting a new one, as it was crucial to keep warm. But she refused, saying that heat packs should be conserved. After that, he took Silby's hands and covered them with his own, giving her the heat pack and asking her not to worry about him. She stood in shock, staring at Lee Ojin. He thought something was wrong, but Silby then said she was just thinking about how incredible Lee Ojin was, probably due to their long time at sea, but Lee Ojin insisted he was just a novice in this matter. Then Silby became curious about why he decided to work at sea. Lee Ojin replied that he was simply responsible. Afterward, she asked if he had planned to do this from the beginning, but it turned out that it had happened by chance. Lee Ojin recounted his long story of how he had failed exams, but thanks to his brother's support, he managed to succeed. His mood changed immediately, and he added that he valued his brother greatly. Silby inquired about his parents. Lee Ojin said he met his brother in an orphanage. After that, Silby felt embarrassed and apologized for her question. But Lee Ojin was not upset in the slightest. She tightly squeezed the heat pack, recalling that she had already talked about her father, and perhaps this saddened Lee Ojin. He noticed this and reassured Silby, saying she could continue to ask him questions. Her mood immediately improved, and she eagerly asked if Lee Ojin had ever lived in the Fuping area. It turned out that his brother lived there with children. Silby lived in the Luliang area. Lee Ojin had been there. Silby mentioned that she was worried about her father because that area had been demolished and housing prices had increased. Lee Ojin said that when they escaped from the island, Silby should hurry home immediately. Silby was not so optimistic as no rescue team had come here, probably due to poor communication. Suddenly, they both fell silent and stared at the door in shock. Lee Ojin said they had to leave the store immediately in the morning, and Silby supported this idea. The water level had risen very sharply and suddenly, all because a hole had appeared in the wall, through which water began to flow in with great force. The store was starting to flood rapidly. Lee Ojin and Sil B did not know what to do. They were in shock and panic. The water level rose so quickly that in a second they were almost submerged. Lee Ojin said they had to get outside quickly before another wave hit. Suddenly his expression changed sharply. He noticed that behind Sil B was a monster that had emerged from the storage room, and it was heading straight for Sil B. Lee Ojin became furious as he had tied up Song Tae tightly, but somehow he had escaped. The monster appeared very quickly, swimming toward them in mere seconds. It suddenly extended its grotesque hand with long claws, but Lee Ojin managed to grab a net and shield himself from the monster. Song Tae's fingers should have been bound with duct tape, but Lee Ojin noticed that one of the monster's hands was missing a finger, and on the other hand there were 6. Then Lee Ojin threw the net at Song Tae with all his strength. Thus he managed to submerge the monster. It seemed that the ropes around its legs had not come undone. Suddenly, Lee Ojin noticed that the ropes he had used to tie up Song Tae had surfaced. He immediately grabbed them, as even a small scratch could be fatal if the monster attacked him. Lee Ojin gathered his courage and began to cautiously approach Song Tae, but a large wave spoiled his plans. It swept Lee Ojin and Sil B off their feet. They barely managed to stay afloat. There was not much strength left to keep themselves above water. If they were swept out to sea, they would simply drown. Sil B suddenly shoved the net away from Lee Ojin with her hand. In doing so, she once again saved his life. But although Lee Ojin hit the net painfully, it prevented him from being pulled into the sea. Lee Ojin coughed loudly and came to his senses from such shock. He immediately told Sil B that he had survived thanks to her and thanked her. Unfortunately, they had lost the monster, but there were more pressing issues. They had to escape quickly, as another wave could be their last. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, Song Tae unexpectedly surfaced next to Sil B and lunged at her. He immediately grabbed her life vest with his grotesque claws. Sil B was terrified. She didn't even have time to react and understand what was happening. But Lee Ojin reacted faster. He grabbed a shelf and shouted for Sil B to lower her head. After that, he threw the shelf at Song Tae with all his might, hitting him squarely in the head. Then Lee Ojin grabbed a sharp stick, and he ruthlessly struck it directly at the monster. Sil B trembled all over and turned away in fear. The monster sank beneath the water, as it had taken a good hit from Lee Ojin. Sil B had just come to her senses when she was ordered to leave. Meanwhile, the water level in the store began to decrease significantly. Suddenly, Sil B noticed something, and it was likely bad news as her expression changed sharply. She called out to Lee Ojin, but he did not pay attention because he wanted to find the rope. But when he turned back, seeing that Sil B was standing her ground, it was already too late. A massive wave was coming toward them. It swept the monster off its feet, and they were next. Lee Ojin barely kept himself afloat. His heart was racing, adrenaline was surging, and it gave his body a second wind. Suddenly, he noticed glass approaching him. It could easily kill Lee Ojin. But the worst part was that everything was leaking from the store because the wave had swept the door away. And the worst happened. Lee Ojin found himself in open water, where the dangers were even greater. This gave him even more strength. He was not afraid in the slightest. He grabbed the bag and confidently told Sil B that they had to leave quickly, as another wave could drown them. He called out to Sil B, but she did not respond, and this made Lee Ojin's heart race faster, as he genuinely worried. She was also nowhere to be seen in the store. Lee Ojin moved closer to the exit and saw the shelf he had struck the monster with. A chill ran through his body. Suddenly, he was overcome with such sadness that he could barely hold back tears. Lee Ojin remembered how good of a person she had been. He said he hoped Sil B had gone to a good place. A lump formed in his throat. Suddenly, Lee Ojin heard a familiar voice calling him. He saw Sil B, who had just surfaced from the water. Her leg was stuck and pulling her down. Lee Ojin immediately came alive. He was genuinely happy that Sil B had survived and rushed to help her. She cursed in pain and fear, and Lee Ojin, like an older brother, corrected her and reassured her that he would help. And he did not lie. Lee Ojin helped Sil B, and together they regained their composure from the adrenaline they had experienced. Sil B thanked him for saving her and said she thought she would truly die this time. At that moment, Lee Ojin's expression changed sharply, but not because of Sil B's harsh words. Rather, it was because they were once again engulfed by a massive wave. even larger than the last. Everything happened very quickly. They barely had time to understand what was happening. Air was scarce, as were their strength. But this time they were lucky, and they managed to escape again. This time they had almost no strength left, and it took them a while to recover. Silby said it felt like she had fallen into hell, which was not the most pleasant place to be. Lee Ojin asked if she had heard everything. It turned out she had, and quite clearly. After that, she fell silent for a while. An awkward pause ensued. Then Silby smiled sweetly and said it was all very much in his style. Lee Ojin decided to change the subject, saying it was dangerous here and they needed to leave quickly. He grabbed the bag and took Silby by the hand, saying they would first return to the hotel. One of her feet was shoeless after that incident. Silby mentioned that it hurt to walk barefoot. Just at that moment, Lee Ojin noticed a flip-flop floating nearby. He caught it for Silby and offered her to try it on. He carefully helped wrap her foot in a bag to keep the shoe in place. Silby tested the new footwear for sturdiness, and it held perfectly. Now they could move on. Lee Ojin suggested they first find a mountain, but when they stepped onto the road, their expressions changed sharply. The entire street before them was completely flooded and littered with debris. Additionally, Lee Ojin did not see his car. It seemed that Hwanga-ae had indeed managed to leave on her own. They were deciding where to go next, which road would be better. Together, they looked at the nearby road. The path ahead was too dangerous, so they had to find a way around. Lee Ojin was determined and said they should set off right now. The sooner they walked, the sooner they would reach the hotel. Suddenly, his expression changed sharply. Around the corner, Lee Ojin heard a sound coming from a car. This could only mean that someone else was nearby, besides them. He ordered Silby to be quiet because he didn't know if it was safe, but his suspicions were shattered by the car key that Silby pulled out. It belonged to the braggart. Lee Ojin cautiously peeked around the corner of the building. Everything was clear, but the car was nowhere to be seen. It seemed to be behind the building. They decided to go through the building rather than around it. It was unclear how it would be safer, but at least there was no water inside. Silby thought this was Lee Ojin's establishment due to the similar name in the title, but it was just a friend of his who had the same name. Suddenly, their faces changed sharply, expressing noticeable shock, for before them stood the very car of the braggart, which had been started. Lee Ojin wanted to scream with joy. Finally, everything was coming together, and now he had a chance for salvation. They immediately headed towards it, not wanting to wait a moment longer. They couldn't wait to reach the hotel. But when Lee Ojin sat behind the wheel, his joy suddenly turned to sorrow. There was no gas inside. It wouldn't go anywhere. Lee Ojin lost that hope. Happiness had been too brief, and he had been tempted by it. No, he couldn't just give up, so he began to search for another way out. He spotted another car ahead and made his way towards it. He peered inside and realized it would suit them. The tank was almost full, but now there was another task: how to execute what Lee Ojin had planned. He saw a hose and an empty bottle on the ground. This was just what he needed. Lee Ojin's heart began to race again, and hope appeared in his eyes. He took out a knife and cut the hose. Then he unscrewed the cap from the gas tank and shoved the hose inside. Silby stood nearby, not understanding what was happening. Then Lee Ojin took the hose and sharply inhaled. Gasoline flowed through the tube, after which Lee Ojin coughed loudly and vomited that gasoline. Then he grabbed the empty bottle and filled it with fuel. Silby watched in shock as everything unfolded. She praised the gentleman, saying he was very clever and capable. There was a warm relationship between the two of them. When the bottle was full, Lee Ojin refueled the braggart's car, and they drove off. The gas should be enough to get to the hotel. Lee Ojin was focused on the road when Silby began to hit him aggressively on the shoulder. Her face was frightened. She was trying to say something, that there was a monster next to them, as well as a little monster child. Lee Ojin froze in shock and called the monster the boss. He recognized him and the little child who had the same name as him. Silby didn't understand why they weren't driving. The monster suddenly appeared at her window, scaring her greatly. Her heart dropped to her feet. She screamed at Lee Ojin in fear, asking why he was waiting and not driving. He slammed on the gas and sped off, apologizing to the boss. One more second and something terrible could have happened. Silby was loudly gasping for breath. Her heart felt like it would leap from her chest and she couldn't come to her senses. Suddenly her expression changed again. Fear returned. For a child was clinging to the glass of the car, holding on tightly. Lee Ojin noticed this and clenched his teeth in sorrow. He felt pity for the child. His heart was breaking with pain. He pressed the gas harder without even realizing it. Silby was scared and screamed for Lee Ojin to stop. Ahead of them was a speed bump, but Lee Ojin had no intention of slowing down. It seemed Silby was the only one afraid. The car simply flew over at high speed. Silby closed her eyes and screamed in fear. She was terrified for her life in those moments. The child barely held on to the car due to the violent impact and speed. Eventually, she couldn't hold on any longer and let go of the vehicle when it skidded sharply around a corner. It seemed Lee Ojin was struggling to control the car because they hit a wall, and the vehicle sparked. By the window, a part of the child's arm remained. It all looked like a horror movie, and they were the main characters. She screamed at Lee Ojin to brake, for now everything was fine. But the young man didn't believe it because he thought the monster was still clinging to the car. But now he composed himself and realized it was just an arm. Panic and fear began to subside and common sense returned. They drove in silence now. The tension in the car was palpable. Lee Ojin was on the verge of tears. He was suddenly overwhelmed by such deep sorrow. It was hard to see familiar faces in such a state. He suddenly thought that his brother could also be infected. And if that were true, Lee Ojin didn't know what the point of living was anymore. Meanwhile, the rain was pouring heavily. Combined with sweat, the water level was rising even higher. The car's wheels were almost halfway submerged in water. Silby got out of the vehicle. They had arrived at the hotel. Ahead was their truck, in which they had all gone to the store. For some reason, the sight made the heart ache. Betrayal is always hard. There were no groceries in the trunk, so they must have already moved everything to the hotel. Suddenly, Lee Ojin remembered something and began rummaging in his pocket. He handed Silby the keys to the braggart's car. He said she should keep them because she had found them. After that, they climbed the stairs to the hotel. Each was wondering what their meeting with Hwanga-e would be like. Lee Ojin carefully opened the door. It was very quiet, and that was frightening. Perhaps they had taken all the infected away when they went to the supermarket. They ascended to the floor and calmly reached the pipe that served as their makeshift door. Silby went first so that Lee Ojin could protect her. Suddenly she stopped. Lee Ojin asked what happened. Silby pulled out a knife from her bag, commenting that whoever made a mistake should face punishment. Silby was furious. Hatred was evident in her eyes. She spoke of Hwanga-e. On the floor, everyone had gathered in the room. No one bee was sweating coldly and anxiously watching what was happening. Silby looked down fiercely, holding the knife in her hands. Pain and anger were simultaneously present in her eyes. Before them, Hwanga-e was bowing on the floor, trembling all over. She clasped her hands and begged for forgiveness. Her left eye wouldn't open because it was bruised, as was the entire left side of her face. She was also missing some upper teeth. Hwanga-e asked them to look at her face and teeth and wondered if they could forgive her. But Silby pressed the knife and ordered her to hand over the food and shut her mouth. She lowered her swollen face in guilt and said there was no more food. Her voice trembled. Silby was in a rage, ready to kill the traitor. Hwanga-e swore that the monsters were to blame for everything and that they had torn the food apart. Then the leader spoke up, saying that if he had known this would happen, he would have stayed in his room. He added that he felt sorry for Sun Tae, but Silby ordered him to shut up as well. Lee Ojin remained the only one silent, suppressing his emotions as he carefully observed each person. The leader caught his gaze and lowered his eyes, as if ashamed to meet his stare. Lee Ojin could not understand where all their bruises came from. Silby interrupted his thoughts, stating that there was no point in sitting there with them without food, and suggested they leave. Suddenly, the leader became indignant at how close they had gotten. For some reason, this deeply affected him, as if he blamed them for it. He said she shouldn't do that, since they had all known each other for a long time, and Silby was betraying them by going with Lee Ojin. But she sharply cut him off, telling him to stop behaving that way as she was leaving. It was not a request. She was stating a fact. Silby added that she would only take her share. But the leader shouted that food could not be taken away, only divided equally. It seemed the leader was panicking greatly. He asked if Silby had thought about what would happen to their lives in that case. She replied that they had never been together. The leader had used them for his own purposes. The leader began to panic even more, unable to utter even 2 words. Silby calmly told Lee Ojin that they should head to the dock. At that moment, Huang Ga-e spoke up. She had not risen from her knees. She extended the key to the car she had stolen. After that, she asked to go to school with her instead of driving. But Silby refused, reminding her that Huang Ga-e had betrayed them and they would not risk it again. However, she had a very compelling argument. There was a chance to connect with the mainland there. This information shocked and stunned Lee Ojin and Silby. Huang Ga-e continued, saying that there was a building on the way, and in one of the rooms, the light was on, meaning someone was there. But it seemed this did not impress Lee Ojin much. Then Huang Ga-e lowered her head, saying there was something else. She gripped her pants tightly. A drop of blood fell on her hand, and with a trembling voice, she said that there was also a medical room at the school, as her beloved still wasn't getting better, even though he had taken the medicine. Then Rowan Bin spoke up, feeling ashamed all the time that his beloved was humiliating herself for him, and apologized for causing so much trouble. Lee Ojin listened to all this and understood that complete chaos was unfolding here, in which he had no desire to participate. Huang Ga-e looked at Lee Ojin and cried, begging him to help her boyfriend, as they would soon be flooded too. She promised to do anything, but Silby replied sharply and briefly that she refused. Her face did not change at all, and there was no compassion in her voice. Then the leader intervened, saying that they would all go together anyway, and it didn't matter whether Silby agreed. But they paid no attention to this circus. They simply turned around and went for food. The leader continued to shout, even ordering them to come to him. Silby just said in parting that they would leave the car keys so they could go wherever they wanted. The leader scratched his neck as if nervously and cursed. At that spot was the same virus. The leader was infected. Silby and Lee Ojin discussed which car would be more convenient. When they both stepped outside, someone called out to Silby. Ye Yuang suggested they talk privately. Silby wanted to find out what was going on first, but Ye Yuang behaved rudely. Then Silby called her a fool. After those words, silence hung between the girls. It was more frightening than any loud quarrel. Then Ye Yuang turned and walked away, telling Silby to follow her because she wouldn't speak in his presence. Silby exhaled irritably, but still followed Ye Yuang even though she was annoyed by these childish games. She waited for her downstairs. A self-satisfied smile appeared on her face, pleased that her manipulations had worked, but Ye Yuang still had to ask triumphantly if Silby hadn't brought that man with her. Silby ignored those words and said she wouldn't wait if Ye Yuang continued to behave that way. She was serious. Then Ye Yuang placed her hand on Silby's shoulder and said she would get straight to the point. After that, she suddenly kneed Silby in the stomach. The poor girl didn't expect that from the little one, so she fell to the ground. She couldn't breathe. Ye Yuang grabbed her by the hair and threatened to kill her if she screamed. Then she commanded in an authoritative voice to hand over the keys. Silby didn't understand what was being said, or pretended not to understand. But Ye Yuang didn't believe her, so she reached into her pocket for them herself. After that, she pulled out the keys to the boastful car they had arrived in. Ye Yuang didn't stop there. She continued to hold Silby by the hair and asked where the car was. She threatened again, mockingly calling Silby sister, and said she was more ruthless than she seemed. Silby asked if she wanted to escape herself. Then Ye Yuang pulled out a lighter, threatening that Silby could get burned if she dragged it out, and added that no one would want to stay with stupid scum. Suddenly, Ye Yuang's voice changed sharply, sounding like that of a monster. She threatened to respond if Silby didn't want to be mutilated. But Silby held on, even though she was truly afraid for her life. After all, cruelty was a common way of communication in their company. Silby said she couldn't explain how suddenly something changed, and she easily gave up the information. When Ye Yuang learned everything she wanted, she simply tossed Silby aside like trash. She trembled, holding herself with her hands, and asked how the others would fare. Ye Yuang replied that it was not her concern, and that Silby was surviving at the expense of that man. Then she pulled out a backpack which contained food and water. Ye Yuang said that the boys had provided all this, calling them disgusting. She planned to leave Silby's things behind, as they were too heavy, and Ye Yuang now had a car, so she owed nothing to anyone. After that, she opened the door they had barricaded well, and she said goodbye to Silby as if they were best friends. But at the last moment, Ye Yuang decided to confess that Silby should beware of that guy. She had recently seen blood on the toilet lid when he came out of the restroom. After that, she turned back and mockingly asked with a smile if nothing would happen to her lord. Meanwhile, Lee Ojin packed all the things into a bag, leaving plenty for the others. Suddenly, he was called. From the tone of the voice, he understood that it was bad news. Silby entered the room feeling shame and guilt. Lee Ojin immediately asked what had happened. She stood curled up, holding her stomach. When Lee Ojin learned what had happened, he immediately worried about Silby's condition. But they still had the keys to another car. Silby ordered them to run quickly before the infected appeared. Lee Ojin didn't understand anything. Silby told him that everything had turned out much better than they had thought. After all, now Ye Yuang would become the bait. As soon as she started the car, all the infected would rush to the sound, and it would become much safer around. They watched the traitor from the window. Silby recalled that Ye Yuang had said the leader had caught the virus, so she suggested quickly telling the others and fleeing. Just then, they heard the same sound and turned sharply. It seemed it was too late. Someone was approaching them quickly with uncertain but loud steps. When they saw it, their faces changed sharply, their hearts raced, and any faith in the future vanished. Then blood poured out. Silby covered her mouth in shock, while Lee Ojin tried to hold himself together. Before them stood a monster. The leader had become a monster, and he bit one of them. He bit the poor Huang Ga-yi, who had only lived for her boyfriend. The leader said that the girl was not suitable for him. He needed a commander. He lunged at Huang Ga-yi, and the girl screamed that it hurt and called for her boyfriend to help. She trembled with fear, but before death she suddenly realized that in this relationship she had loved only herself, and that Ro Wanbin would not help her. With a shaking hand, she tried to reach the bed where her beloved lay, but her coward had long since jumped out of bed and rushed toward the door. The head was simply devouring Huang Ga-yi, who had fought so hard for her beloved's life. Suddenly he was distracted and turned around. After all, Lee Ojin, Silby, and the sick Ro Wanbin, who was barely clinging to life, fled as fast as they could. They ran quickly, adrenaline surging. Suddenly, they were stopped by Ro Wanbin, who frightened them greatly and begged to be taken along because he was sick. Silby replied that the sick classmate was too fast and lively. There was no compassion in her voice. Lee Ojin abruptly swung the door open, after which the two quickly got into the car, eager to escape this madness. Suddenly, Ro Wanbin knocked on Lee Ojin's window. He swore he was not infected and pleaded to be taken along, claiming he had nothing to do with Huang Ga-yi and that it was she who had set everyone up, not him. Thus, Ro Wanbin revealed his true face. Silby said she doubted whether to take him, but after those words, her doubts vanished. The car sped away, splattering Ro Wanbin. They needed no traitors. He cursed, after which he began to cry. He did not know who would take care of him now, and said he missed his mother dearly. His mother's little one did not know how to live alone. Suddenly, someone who would definitely take care of him spoke up, but it seemed that Ro Wanbin was not very happy about this meeting. His Huang Ga-yi had come for him. Even as a monster, she did not stop caring for her beloved. Ro Wanbin began to run away, screaming and cursing at Huang Ga-yi, as suddenly he slipped, and he fell sharply onto his back. It seemed that his end had come, but the monsters did not notice him. Then his clever head spotted a grate where he could hide. The sick body, which had no strength even to introduce itself, forcefully opened the tightly welded grate, after which he just as forcefully closed it behind him. The moaning, that is Ro Wanbin, could breathe a sigh of relief. He looked around the place he had entered. There was only one exit. With no choice, Ro Wanbin crawled through the pipe, cursing Lee Ojin, for everything had gone wrong since his appearance. Everyone was to blame for his troubles, except him. The brave man was frightened by the slugs that swarmed in the pipe. The water level was rising, and the passage seemed to be getting narrower. His body barely fit through. Suddenly he heard a loud noise of water, after which he was engulfed by a large wave. Meanwhile, the monsters walked around that pipe in search of new victims, and Lee Ojin and Silby arrived at the school. They had other plans, but the water level was rising significantly, so it was safer to stay elevated. Besides, it would not be bad to send a signal to the mainland. The car also stalled. Now they definitely had no choice left. Silby remained positive, saying that there was little fuel anyway, and they were lucky to have made it to the school at all. Then she opened the glove compartment and took out some tools. She explained this by saying that it was worth having some protection with them, after which she ordered the enchanted Lee Ojin to go. They got out of the car, standing in the rain. Silby waited while Lee Ojin fashioned a weapon from a knife and a stick. He said he would go first, and she was to follow cautiously behind him, and they set off together. Suddenly, for some reason, Silby stopped. She said something very strange was happening at the playground. Lee Ojin also noticed it was odd that a swamp had formed there, although it had not been there before. Suddenly, Silby pulled him down with her and ordered him to be quiet. For some reason, they both began to feel danger. They were so close to each other. Silby pointed in a direction. This was already beyond reality and something from the realm of fantasy. Strange tentacles began to rise from the swamp. Lee Ojin asked how Silby had noticed this, to which she replied that she just felt something was off. At that moment, they heard screams, human screams calling for help. They came from the same window. After which a body fell to the ground. The man who had been screaming got up. His body trembled from such a strong blow. But he had very little strength left, so he begged for help. He fell next to that field, and the tentacles began to move strangely at the appearance of the body. Lee Ojin and Silby froze in shock. They could not believe their eyes. Suddenly a monster emerged from the ground. From its body, or rather those Balyanuses, the same tentacles grew. There were many monsters. They seemed to emerge from the water and pounced on the living flesh. It all resembled a horror movie. Blood ran cold in their veins at the sight. Lee Ojin shielded the frightened Silby, although he was no less afraid. The monsters instantly devoured that poor soul. But now they did not know what to do next, as the idea of going to school seemed terrible. Suddenly, in the distance, as if in the sky, something began to ring, but it turned out to be just the school radio. It announced that if the broadcast was working, it meant someone was still in the building. Then it transmitted symptoms of infection and information about the monsters. Silby asked how the radio was working without electricity, and the clever Lee Ojin replied that they had a backup supply of generators. Then they decided to go to the school after all, but to approach through the back entrance, as the monsters were focused on the radio. They passed cautiously. In fact, they were a step away from danger, but luck was on their side. Silby complained that everything was somehow too difficult. After all, in front of them were doors that someone had locked with a chain. Then Silby suggested entering through another door when she saw Lee Ojin's disappointed face. It turned out that nearby there were open doors. With no choice, although it seemed suspicious, they cautiously entered inside. It seemed nothing could surprise or scare them anymore, but they were mistaken. The room looked as if it had been through an apocalypse. All the chairs were overturned. The floor and furniture were covered in blood. Fingers were scattered everywhere, and the edges of plates were also broken. The sight made their blood run cold in their veins. These were all children. Lee Ojin saw the bewildered look on Silby's face and ordered her not to linger. They moved on, with Lee Ojin leading the way, shielding Silby with his body. Then they opened the dining room door, and it was no better inside. The second time was not as frightening. Woodlice scurried across the floor. While Lee Ojin was distracted by them, Silby noticed something dangerous. Before them stood a monster who initially did not see them. It was a woman with bandages on her face, drool dripping from her mouth. She didn't seem like a monster, but she inspired no trust. When she saw them, she immediately reached out, asking for help. Her body trembled, and her nails resembled those of monsters. Lee Ojin and Silby could not determine if she was a monster or a human. She was very close to Lee Ojin, and that frightened him. The instinct to not attack a person held him back. But he did not want to die either. So Lee Ojin and Silby grabbed their weapons and defended themselves against the woman. With those blows, she immediately fell to the floor. Lee Ojin plunged his weapon straight into her heart. His body trembled. He didn't even understand what he was doing, but he did it. What if she wasn't a monster, and he had killed an innocent person who had already been lucky enough to survive among monsters? Only now did Lee Ojin notice that her face was clean, without scars or blisters. Silby noticed the bewildered look on Lee Ojin's face. She tried to calm him, but it didn't work. He screamed that this woman was no longer a human. It was as if he was trying to reassure himself of that. Silence fell. Lee Ojin fell to his knees before the woman's body. Silby did not understand what was happening. Nearby lay chopsticks. He picked them up. After that, he reached for the body and peeled off the bandage. And there they were. Blisters. Lee Ojin hadn't killed a human. She was already a monster. He immediately exhaled in relief and collapsed to the floor where a worried Silby caught him. When Lee Ojin came to his senses, they decided to split up and explore the area, but Silby should not wander far. Lee Ojin entered a room. There were many things inside. He even found some useful items. Woodlice continued to scurry across the floor. He did not understand where they were all running to. Suddenly, Lee Ojin heard screams. Silby could be in danger. He immediately ran toward the sound. There she was, alive. But what Lee Ojin saw surpassed all the horror he had experienced before. He would never be the same after what he had endured. Silby said she had gone after cockroaches but ended up in this graveyard. She suggested that perhaps it was not worth going higher. Lee Ojin almost agreed but told himself to pull himself together and calm down. He had to do everything to survive. After that, he handed Silby some items. He ordered her to change if she wanted to see her parents again. Those words struck a chord. After all, the children behind them would never see theirs again. Lee Ojin changed and was ready. But climbing up was not as easy as he thought. The third floor was also barricaded. Silby did not lose her composure and immediately began searching for another way. And she found it. A small hole through which they could crawl. Lee Ojin went first. But there was no one on the floor, only traces of bloody, savage murders. They seemed to have to get used to this, but it was always painful to realize how many innocents had perished. Suddenly they heard voices. Lee Ojin and Silby froze to listen and not give themselves away. Then someone came out to them. It was a student. He looked battered but entirely human. Silby immediately rushed at him with questions. But the boy ignored them and simply turned around and walked away. There were 2 more students. They hoped they were rescuers but were disappointed. Silby overheard their conversation and said they had come through a hole in the door. The boys were upset that the door had burst, and there were many infected teachers inside. Silby reassured them that the hole was small and the monsters could not get through. The boys silently stared at them. Silby continued speaking. She asked how to get upstairs. It turned out there were stairs on the opposite side. Silby explained, seeing their surprised looks, that they had heard the sound of a radio and wanted to send a signal from the broadcasting room. The boys appreciated this idea and asked to be informed about them when help was called. The boy with bruises on his face stared intently at Silby. She responded with a look of her own. After that, she asked if she could take a look at his face. The boy immediately screamed and began waving his arms as Silby tried to touch him. It turned out his name was Jemin. His friends tried to calm him down. Silby and Lee Ojin did not understand what was happening. One of the students explained that the friend was just tired but was not infected. Silby did not believe it. She asked why they had told Jimin to check who was coming if he felt unwell. The student explained that it was Jamin's idea, as he was worried about being a burden to them. Silby stood her ground, saying that the bruises made it look more like they had beaten Jamin, and they didn't look like friends either. The boys continued to justify themselves, saying they got along well and shared food, and the bruises on Jamin were from him falling. Silby did not believe it. Then a hand on Jamin's shoulder suddenly tightened as if signaling. Lee Ojin and Silby immediately noticed this. Then Jamin spoke in a timid voice, stuttering. He wanted to ask them for a favor. He said their supplies had run out a couple of days ago, so Jamin was asking for food. It looked as if the boys had taken a kitten to beg for food. Lee Ojin began rummaging through his bag. Jamin handed over a tray with a broken corner, which they had already seen below, and asked to put food on it. Lee Ojin found this strange but agreed. Suddenly, Silby stopped him sharply. She looked into the eyes of those students. Their gaze was very calm and relaxed. After that, Silby snatched the can from Lee Ojin's hands. She placed it on the floor and the boys thanked her, forcing smiles onto their faces. After which, they turned and left. 2 boys were eating. They actually had a lot of food. They discussed how they had missed a great opportunity. One of them said that the scum was worried about the broken tray. He mentioned that it wasn't worth dealing with them right now, since they wanted to send a signal for help, so let them live for now. Lee Ojin asked why Silby had suspected them. It turned out that no one in such a situation would think to use a tray. And those cut corners, they seemed too suspicious next to those fingers on the lower floor. Meanwhile, one of the students said that Jamin should also eat. Then the chubby one opened some doors. There he sat, all in tears. The light-haired boy said he needed to trim his bangs and asked if Jamin was sad. He threatened to leave him fingerless for his silence. Lee Ojin and Silby continued to watch. They were disgusted by those scoundrels. Such people had no place to live. Jamin cried and trembled, saying he was wrong. Then the light-haired boy ordered him to sit in the cupboard for another 2 hours and think about his behavior. And then he said that if he didn't want to, he had to eat this and handed Jamin a slug. They mocked the poor guy. saying it was unhealthy to eat cookies and drinks and that one shouldn't be picky about food. After which they grabbed Jamin by the hair. He shut his eyes and cried. The slug was almost at his mouth. The boy trembled violently but couldn't do anything. He thought it would be better to die than endure all this. And at that moment the door swung open and an enraged Sil B entered. She chased those scoundrels away and headed straight for Jamin. Sil B extended her hand to him and ordered him not to let anyone bully him, offering to leave together. But Jamin refused. He said he was useless. And so he wanted to stay there with his friends. Sil B couldn't believe what she heard. Those scoundrels had brainwashed him so thoroughly. But she resigned herself. She turned and left. The boys looked at her with frightened faces. As Sil B walked away, she heard them discussing how scared they were. Lee Ojin asked if they really shouldn't take that boy away from them. But Sil B didn't even listen, interrupting him and saying they should respect others' decisions. Moreover, Jamin had something in his eye. He was infected. Meanwhile, they reached the corridor. The wind there was terrible. It nearly swept them away. He told Sil B to be careful. But she didn't respond. Lee Ojin called her several times. On the 5th call, she heard him. Lee Ojin asked what she was so focused on thinking about. Sil B fell silent for a moment. Then she said she felt sad for that boy. It would have been nice to take him with them, but they couldn't do anything. As she spoke, something flew from the sky. It flew very fast and sharply until it crashed into the bridge. Lee Ojin and Sil B crouched in shock and surprise. A huge object flew right in front of them, but once again, they were lucky to survive. But moving forward now was quite a challenge. Lee Ojin held himself together better, saying it was all trivial since they had come a long way. He went first, as always. Sil B followed behind him. Eventually they reached the doors, but paused before the exit. Everything, as usual, was covered in blood. There was no choice. They had to go where it was scary. And it was scary everywhere. Lee Ojin entered first, Sil B behind him. Next to them was a medical room. Lee Ojin suggested they check it out since there might be something useful inside. Inside was the usual chaos. Everything was in blood and the furniture was overturned. Infected individuals were nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Sil B noticed something and called Lee Ojin. She found records that someone had kept before their arrival. The records contained a wealth of useful information, even things they didn't know yet. It turned out there was a chance of survival even after infection. Both were shocked by what they read. Suddenly, Lee Ojin noticed a note on the floor. It stated that all survivors should go to the 5th floor. He decided it was the same room with the radio. Now they had even more confidence and desire to head upstairs. There was hope that there they would find salvation and return to their homes. But ahead, they encountered a blocked path again. Sil B suggested clearing it, but Lee Ojin thought everything would just fall on them. Then she suggested checking the other end of the corridor. And they went. Lee Ojin crawled underneath. He thought he found an exit. But even there, everything was barricaded. They needed to search for more options. Lee Ojin was losing hope, but Sil B remained positive and had an idea. She suggested they enter an office and exit from the other side. And they did just that. Suddenly, Lee Ojin's expression changed sharply as he looked through the window. There he saw monster students wandering around the office. A slight fear coursed through his body. They crouched down and whispered about what to do next since they couldn't get through the monsters. Suddenly, Lee Ojin noticed something. A rope hanging as if from a higher floor. He stepped out to look up, and the rope was indeed 1 floor below. They could climb up it. It was risky, but they were used to it. Lee Ojin went first. He never would have thought he could be so fearless and brave. Hard times create strong people. Lee Ojin was almost there. His hands trembled. It was difficult and terrifying. Just a little more, and he would be at his destination. Finally, he reached the ground. Lee Ojin exhaled with relief. The rope was tied to the furniture. It seemed almost comical. Someone had tied it in a way that it would definitely hold. Lee Ojin told Sil B to climb up as well, because it was safe there. She was ready too, at least she pretended to be. Suddenly, Sil B noticed something. A monster was right next to her, right by the window, and Sil B was hanging in the air. She barely dodged the monster that peeked through the window. Her heart raced wildly because there was nowhere to run and she had no weapon. Lee Ojin shouted for Sil B to quickly lean to the left. She did just that, and at that moment something heavy flew down at the monster. It fell out of the window. Lee Ojin worried about her even from a distance. Sil B tried to regain her composure and climb up. Her heart raced, her hands were sweaty, and her body trembled. Suddenly, something touched her leg. Sil B was genuinely frightened. Lee Ojin yelled at her to climb faster. Sylvie was almost safe. Only one last push remained. And finally, Lee Ojin grabbed her hand. Sylvie reached the ground. It felt so good to feel the concrete under her feet. She said that this time she thought she would definitely die. Lee Ojin apologized for his inattentiveness. Then he suggested they rest for a bit before moving on. Sylvie smiled and said it was all good. She was an incredible girl. Meanwhile, they reached yet another dead end. Suddenly, they saw something strange in front of them. A koi fish lay on the floor, its belly torn open. They decided it had been left there on purpose, since the aquarium was a passageway. Lee Ojin and Sylvie stood by the aquarium, but there was no way forward. Suddenly, a fishing line with a bell wrapped around Lee Ojin's leg. He only managed to hear the ringing. In that very second, a fishing net suddenly fell on him. Then a woman in glasses appeared and asked who they were. Meanwhile, tea was already being poured. At the table sat Lee Ojin, Sylvie, and the mysterious woman. She introduced herself as Choi Ji-hyo. She worked as the school doctor on the island. It turned out she was the one speaking on the radio back then and had saved their lives. Choi Ji-hyo noted that they had found a way to get there very quickly. Sylvie laughed, saying they had used the same method simply. Then the two women began enthusiastically discussing how to build barricades better. Choi Ji-hyo praised their intelligence but sadly said it was soon time to leave. Sylvie and Lee Ojin did not hide their shock that she planned to leave. They said they had come to this place to send a signal for help. Choi Ji-hyo said she was sorry, but she had already tried to do that. No one responded. Then Lee Ojin asked where her husband was. It turned out he was in the teacher's dormitory. He had injured his leg and decided not to leave with her. Then she pointed to the light in the neighboring building and said she needed to go there. And then Choi Ji-hyo suggested they go together since they were lucky to meet in this place. She presented the main argument, after which they would definitely not refuse. There was a fishing boat, and that truly shocked and even delighted them. Choi Ji-hyo said the boat wasn't big, but they could all fit in it. Then Lee Ojin asked why she hadn't escaped earlier. It seemed he had struck a nerve. Choi Ji-hyo's mood changed abruptly. Then she spoke about the jars that were in the nearby cabinet. They were all her parasite experiments. Choi Ji-hyo had been researching this infection all this time. She wanted to tell the children about it. At first, she also wanted to escape, but she thought of her students and lacked the strength to leave them behind. So this decision was difficult for her. Doubts still lingered. They tried to encourage Choi Ji-hyo, assuring her that the children would understand her choice. And it seemed to work. Sylvie always found the right words. Choi Ji-hyo went first. They decided to move. She was the first to descend the rope. They quickly covered most of the way, avoiding monsters. Suddenly, they encountered something strange along the way. Something huge was right in the middle of the stairs. Choi Ji-hyo had never seen this before. It had appeared while they were upstairs. She suggested they get out of the building quickly. There was another secret exit to the dormitory, and eventually she led them out of that nightmare. Only a little remained to reach the dormitory. They climbed over the large gates that served as the entrance to the school, after which Choi Ji-hyo knocked on the door. A voice immediately asked who was there. She gently told her beloved that it was her. Her husband came out, and Choi Ji-hyo immediately threw her arms around him. He even forgot about his injured leg. It was a ray of happiness in such difficult times. Choi Ji-hyo completely forgot to introduce her new friends. Her husband bowed to them, thanking them for bringing his wife back safely. His name was Ki Hyun-seok. His wife said they had to leave quickly because the water level was rising rapidly. Ki Hyun-seok immediately began to think about how to get the boat to the dock. They needed a vehicle. At that moment, Lee Ojin spoke up, saying they just happened to have a truck. That was simply wonderful news. But the bad news was that there was no gas in it at all. They could wait until the water rose even higher and then set off. But that was too risky. Lee Ojin had a brilliant idea to use fuel from the boat. Then he decided to drive the car to the dormitory and then set off. Choi Ji-hyo offered her help, but Lee Ojin refused, saying he didn't want to separate a family that hadn't seen each other in a long time. At that moment, Sylvie suddenly threatened him with a wrench, after which she smiled and said that Lee Ojin didn't think of leaving her there. She seemed even more beautiful in those moments. Lee Ojin asked if Sylvie was really sure she wanted to go. Now there was a problem regarding which way they should go. They decided to take the same path they had come, as the road was too muddy, so they headed for the car. They reached that gap in the door, but when they climbed over, they were in shock. For before them stood a huge cabinet that blocked their way. It hadn't been there last time, but they had advised the students to barricade themselves against that hole. Suddenly, Silby noticed something above. The window was open and the wind was blowing in. Silby was very scared. There was a wild fear in her eyes. She asked Lee Ojin what had happened. After all the walls and the ceiling were scratched. Suddenly, Silby stepped into something sticky. It resembled both water and slime at the same time. This only heightened their fear, but Lee Ojin ordered them to gather themselves and reach the car. So they decided to move on and ignore all of this, when suddenly they froze in shock again, for they saw torn metal doors covered in blood. The hole was very large. It couldn't have been just a student. The stairs were also bloody, as if there was a whole trail, but the worst awaited them ahead. The water level had risen sharply and dramatically. Lee Ojin ran quickly ahead, pulling Silby along. Finally, they reached the car. All that was left was to fill it with fuel and drive away. Lee Ojin was in such a hurry that his movements became more clumsy. Silby kept an eye on him, but there was one problem. She asked Lee Ojin to finish up faster, but for some reason the gas wouldn't go in, as if the tank was full. When Lee Ojin turned around, he couldn't believe his eyes. They both froze in shock. Their hearts raced. Adrenaline signaled to flee, but there was nowhere to run. For a huge monster with limbs, without a head or body, was coming toward them. Just a cabinet. Lee Ojin couldn't understand what it was. He immediately ordered Silby to get inside the car. Suddenly, the monster jumped into the air and flew straight at the two of them. Lee Ojin shoved Silby into the car to keep her safe. But at that moment, the monster leaped and landed on the car. Silby saw its hand, which was the size of its head. Slime dripped from it, the same they had seen on the floor. Silby began to flee from the car, fearing that the monster would simply crush her. At that moment, its limbs hung in the air. Then they struck the car. Silby managed to escape just in time. She turned around and screamed. She was so scared that she didn't know what to do. Lee Ojin was climbing in nearby when suddenly the monster grabbed him by the leg. He ordered Silby to run and not wait for him, not to risk her life. Her hand trembled violently, but she gathered all her will and struck the monster's hand sharply. There were several hits, and this made the monster release Lee Ojin. They both fell out of the car and landed right in the water. Silby was more composed, so she lifted Lee Ojin, who still couldn't come to his senses. Suddenly they froze in shock. Their eyes seemed about to pop out, for the monster appeared to be even larger, and its hand was approaching them. In Lee Ojin's hands was fuel. Silby noticed this and quickly snatched it away, after which she took a sip. It was a sort of Molotov cocktail. She threw it as far as she could, and in that very second, a huge explosion occurred. This gave them a little time to run into the building and hide. But the huge monster was running after them, now even angrier because of what had been done to it. On the floor lay the same woman that Lee Ojin had killed. The monster ran, leaving wet trails behind it. The team hid quietly, waiting for action, after which they exchanged glances and nodded to each other. Lee Ojin cautiously peeked around the corner. The monster was there, devouring the body. Its attention was focused on it, but it was still hard and terrifying to watch. Silby asked what they should do now, as there was still no fuel in the car. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came to her mind. As always, Silby had come to the rescue. She said she had seen in monster movies that cooking oil was used as fuel for trucks. For some reason, Lee Ojin immediately believed her and agreed to try. Although he had no choice, it was better than nothing. Suddenly, he noticed something too. Right behind the mountain of oil was a window. They could exit through it. Luck was on their side again. They carefully approached the oil and took as much as they could carry, after which they went to the window, and then they quickly ran out of that chaos and horror. Finally, they reached the car again. Their happiness knew no bounds. Lee Ojin grabbed a stick, then he shoved it into the fuel hole. It seemed to be clogged with parasites, and finally the vehicle started moving. They rejoiced, for hope for salvation had returned at last. In the meantime, they had already reached the dormitory. He shouted for them to get in the car faster, as he didn't know how long it would last on this fuel. Suddenly, his expression changed sharply. For Lee, Ojin had spotted a monster walking right behind them. Now it had a mouth and a tongue. But Choi Ji-hyo and Ki-hyun Seok were already getting into the car. They still had a chance to make it. Choi Ji-hyo asked if she could study this monster, and Silby replied that they would believe in her. Suddenly, she mentioned that she had returned to school once again. Choi Ji-hyo recounted that there had been something astonishing there. She had written her name on a mollusk, and then its shell began to crack, after which many hands started to emerge from within. Most likely it was a new species of parasites. Silbi mentioned that they had encountered one as well. Ki Hyun Seok stated that they had only managed to survive by setting the monster on fire. The parasites, as soon as they appeared, immediately began searching for a shell, like a crab. Then the man noticed that the water level was sufficient and suggested they stop. They all climbed out of the car, after which they boarded a boat. The wind intensified and the waves were furious. Lee Ojin gazed at his first workplace. He felt strange emotions. This was his first job. Choi Ji-hyo noticed the thoughtful look on his face and asked what was the matter. He explained that he had achieved something for the first time on the island and now felt as if he was leaving something very important behind. Choi Ji-hyo supported Lee Ojin, echoing Silbi's words. Even here she was helping. Then he asked what kind of monster it was after all. But Choi Ji-hyo also didn't fully understand its origins. She only knew it was a mutant, perhaps a new species of crab. But the species would only multiply, as the mutation of one would give rise to more variations of the organism. Therefore, they had to be very cautious, Choi Ji-hyo wanted to say, but something suddenly interrupted her.